I'm Getty Wustula, Associate Director for the Humanities Center here at Northeastern. And I want to welcome you to our fourth Faculty Works in Progress session that is associated with our Fellows Program for this year. This is the last Faculty Works in Progress session. The topic from this year was unsettling, of course, and we're going to hear from 4 of our fellows today. This is also an opportunity for us to cap off the year and to celebrate all the work that the fellows have done over the course of the year. So I'm going to keep my introductions here really short because we got 4 people to get through. So I'm going to introduce everyone who's going to go, and then we will, the order, unless people have objections, will be Caleb, Mario, Candice, and then Cassie at the end. So I want to introduce everyone now, and then we will jump to Caleb. So our first fellow who will be speaking to us today is Caleb Gale, who's Associate Professor of Journalism and Africana Studies here at Northeastern University, Boston. Talk is entitled Heirs to a Stolen Harvest. Next will be Mario Fernandez, who's Associate Professor of Sociology at Northeastern University, Oakland. Mario's talk is going to be titled From Occupation to Ownership, Reimagining Urban Land Through Community Land Trust. Third will be my colleague, Candice Delmas, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy and Political Science, who will be speaking to us about the ethic of courtroom resistance, among other things. And last will be Cassie Tanks, who is a PhD candidate in world history, who will be talking to us about the New Deal Network. So without further ado, Caleb, feel free to take us away.
Hi there, everyone. Greetings from Denver, where I'm currently at a conference, and I snuck away to a WeWork, so apologies for like the sheer number of glass windows that you see around me. I also didn't know until 2 seconds ago that I'd be going first, so thanks so much for the warning. So I guess the best thing I could do is provide quickly a summary of what the project is that I have been working on this past year. Second, I'll move to kind of what work was done during this period, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what comes next. So quick introduction. My name is Caleb Gale. I'm a professor, in journalism and Africana studies, and I'm also a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, where I write exhaustively long investigative stories and bother people. That's kind of my job. I really love to annoy people. And it was in the process of annoying people in Charleston, South Carolina, where I was working on a story about land capture, specifically done by actually a Bostonian who found that Charleston and the surrounding areas had, especially with Black ownership, had in many cases laid fallow and been subject to fractionation and heirs property complications. And he started to employ a variety of genealogists to contact Black people who had not lived in that part of South Carolina for a really, really long time, and began to notify them that your ancestors, some 150 years ago, through something called the Port Royal experiment, which we don't have time to go into depth on today, actually had claims to this land dating back ages. Now, there are some taxes, he would tell them, that are owed on this, but I'm more than happy to take this land off of your hands for $80,000. Now, when you figure that a lot of these families got this land almost at $10, $80,000, especially when you didn't know that you had any land, is a pretty extraordinary thing. And then on top of that, a lot of folks who have moved due to things like the Great Migration and various other sort of migratory patterns ended up realizing that, like, oh, I didn't even know that I had land or even ancestors from that part of the country. And then he would say, he would, of course, withhold from you that land that he's offering 80,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 is actually worth, in many cases, roughly between $700,000 and $950,000. So when I happened upon this, I happened upon the fact that this guy who was doing a lot of this work was actually based here in Boston. I did what all journalists do, especially investigative journalists. I just started going through your trash. I start showing up at your house. I started asking you a lot of questions. I show up in places that I don't belong. But during that process, I ended up staying at a beautiful resort in Charleston, because why not? It's the New York Times. It's the only successful journalistic outlet still left. Just a joke, because I don't hear enough laughter in the room. So I got this wonderful resort. I was going to stay at the. I was going to sauna. I was going to get massages. I was going to do all of those things. And then I realized that I had gotten the one room left at this place called Middleton Place, which of course I had only come to learn about because my wife had once wanted to get married there with me. And it was so far out of our price range, something like $100,000 to rent the horse stable barn area where you could do your first dance. What I noticed while I was there was that there were a lot of people with the same last names, names that'll be familiar to you, not just Middleton, but the people that they married into 4 centuries ago. People with the names like, if you walk through Beacon Hill, Pinckney and Coatsworth, and Pringle and Izzard. And what was particularly odd was that a lot of the Black people who were there didn't know that a lot of white people would be showing up. And a lot of the white people who were there didn't know a lot of Black people would be showing up. It was a family reunion, a deeply uncomfortable one, that had been convened at Middleton Place. And Middleton Place was formerly Middleton Plantation. And Middleton Plantation is a way into understanding what I had long been worried about or concerned that I couldn't, as a writer, as a journalist, as a historian, that I couldn't appropriately render on the page, which was the story of the racial wealth gap. So to bring you current, my book is no longer called Heirs to a Stolen Harvest, because that is, as you end up learning in the trade press world, that is a bad title. It's too clever by half, and that A House Divided is a far better title. And really what it does is that it tracks this family over the past 400 years, dating back to about 1635 until now, on both the Black and white side of the family, the descendants of whom were at this incredibly uncomfortable reunion that I decided, as a journalist, I felt entitled to just show up at and eat all the food and ask people uncomfortable questions. That, in fact, we could tell this persistent problem of the racial wealth gap through the story of this one family. That this family whose property, it's where it's situated, enabled them to accumulate a significant amount of wealth, but did so not through ways we would be normally comfortable discussing. Peter Wood, some 50 plus years ago, would describe it as the capture of their minds. But what we see is that this family very meticulously and carefully enslaved Black people from the rice coast, in part because rice, unlike cotton, unlike tobacco, unlike a variety of types of products, has what we would in the business world call a very significant moat. It's incredibly hard to do. It's really incredibly hard to manufacture. It's hard to identify the most appropriate places. If there's too much salination, the rice won't work. And that family built a significant amount of wealth. And this family became our founding fathers. This family signed the Orders of Secession. This family was responsible for the development of patent law in America. This family served as ambassadors and senators and governors, so much so that the story really didn't crystallize for me until while during this process of this past year, working with a research assistant that I was able to hire due to the support of this fellowship, and also the time that came with it. We were able to locate and kind of reconstruct the First Continental Congress, as well as the Second Continental Congress, in which this family from South Carolina was sent and dispatched as delegates from South Carolina. And at the point at which during this Continental Congress, people were getting very excited to stop trade with Britain, a particular man by the name of Henry Middleton stood up and said, I'm deeply uninterested in that prospect. In fact, I'm willing to stop trade with all sorts, but I'm not going to stop the sale of rice. And so one exception was created for this one family. In terms of the archival record, while we were also doing that work, we just kind of very meticulously went through the enslaved population that Henry Middleton had. Roughly about 800 enslaved people, and one person in particular named Thomas, born in 1737, became our key to being able to tell parallel stories over hundreds of years, because Thomas was not allowed, was seen as large and strong, and was dispatched initially to be what was called a driver on the plantation, someone who would whip, literally, and I don't mean this colloquially, whip people into shape. And Thomas rebuffed that request, rebuffed that command. And so they initially thought, well, let's put him just as a worker in the fields. And they thought, well, his rebel rousing ways might start a riot. We can't have that. And so as such, he was dispatched to be a valet for Henry Middleton's sons. At which point Henry Middleton's sons taught this young man how to read and write in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and English. And so as such, this family in fits and starts to appear in the archives, dating back to the 1700s. And that was one of the findings we had during this time period. So as such, we reconstructed a lot of what I had planned on doing, because there was a lot more information to really carry us through from about the 1630s through present day. And the book now is called The House Divided. It's The House Divided, The Origins of the Racial Wealth Gap in a 400-Year Family Saga. And it's currently now on the market to be sold. And so we're doing what happens in the trade press world, where we spend a lot of time going back and forth between Boston and New York, having conversations and starting what's kind of more formally accepting bids and an auction process. The project won't be done until roughly 2031. That's when the delivery date is 2031, because it takes such meticulous tracking, because it also, on top of that, doesn't just include a lot of economic analysis or sociological analysis. It also requires really careful minding of the archive, or even minding the gaps and the fragments in the archives, minding where things are missing. And then, more importantly than that, especially from the trade press perspective, is writing something beautiful. And so what I spend a lot of my time doing is thinking very carefully about tone and style. And so in many cases, this book didn't really crystallize that well until really spending a lot more time with Faulkner, and even Faulkner from a more historic perspective, but then also Jesmond Ward in a more present and contemporary perspective, to figure out a way to keep a reader going for 400 years and ensure that the book is not 1,000 pages is a really tricky thing to do. So over this upcoming several years, now that I'm finally done with the 39 city tour of my current book, Black Moses, is really spending significant time back and forth between here in Charleston, here in London, here and Philadelphia, Newport, and North Carolina, where the family's disparate archives are. And we will be compiling that together. Getty, I want to make sure that I'm not talking too long. And is there opportunity for Q&A, or should I pause once I'm done and we would transfer to the next person?
Yeah, I think like we could probably, like, if you want a couple more minutes to wrap up, but we should move to Mario. Yeah.
And then we have Q&A at the end.
Yeah,
Is that right? Yeah.
If we have time. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So the kind of the wrapping up of the story is that what was initially supposed to be a kind of throwaway story about a relatively nefarious actor in Boston trying to gobble up portions of South Carolina up from under people has now become a much larger and longer tale about how this particular family has been part of architecting what the racial wealth gap is at a macro level, whilst at the same time telling a very intimate family tale, replete with family dramas that then resulted in certain even in fact the spilling over of what happened in the Continental Congress was really a function of a disagreement between Henry Middleton and his son-in-laws, right? So how do we parse out some of those details and then put them on the page in a way that's really hopefully beautiful, and then at the same time paralleling that with the narratives of Black people who luckily in my case had access to reading and writing long before Black people en masse did. And in that way, hopefully, we can kind of tell this very kind of moving tale between one family with two very different experiences. And then also weaving in a lot of my applied economics background to being able to track from both an economic, financial, and statistical perspective, what that then portends for the rest of us. So that's kind of what's happened during this process. I wouldn't have been able to come to some of these kind of crazy findings without both the time and the resources to just immerse myself in papers, very old papers. One quick example, one quick anecdote. I'm about a quarter of the way through Henry Middleton's papers, and it has been 6 months. So that kind of gives you a sense of just how much there is in fact there. And I'm super excited to keep on going.
That was fabulous. Mario, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, does that show up there for you guys?
Yep.
All right. Hey,
Do you want
everybody.
to just choose slideshow so that we can?
My computer's really slow for some reason. Okay, does that work?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Mario Hernandez. I'm an associate professor of sociology on the Oakland campus. And today I'll be talking about my paper. This is not the title of the paper, this is the title of the project overall that I've kind of initiated since the publication of my first book, From Occupation to Ownership, Reimagining the Urban through Community Land Trusts. This paper, thankfully, I was able to submit it because of the time and the distance. I appreciate it. So this, I just submitted it last month. So waiting to hear back from city and community. So we'll see how it goes. But let me talk about the projects overall. My first book was about Bushwick in Brooklyn. The idea here in a lot of my work up until now has been really focusing on diagnosing the problem, right? Looking at how gentrification occurs in neighborhoods and what's the fallout of it, right? And so since then, I've been really focused on how communities are resisting such action. So I'm working on a 3-paper series focused on community land trusts and different ways they're used for community engaged research, community engaged responses. And so the first one that I published was on Segorite Land Trust. And the second one now is that I just submitted is this one that I'll be presenting to you on Moms for Housing, which I'll talk about in a bit. And the final one is Esther's Orbit Room, which is a commercial space. The first paper looks at how Indigenous communities are able to use a community land trust model, particularly where they're not recognized by the federal government, so they have no entitlements to land, how the community land trust model is able to help them acquire land. And this is a parking lot that has served for over 100 years as the parking lot of a seafood restaurant. It is a sacred site. There were plans to develop it. It was going to be 50% affordable housing. This is renderings of what they wanted to build there after the restaurant sold to this private developer. And I remember in 2019, I was sure that this was going to go through because of the affordable housing crisis here in the Bay Area. But through resistance, that paper talks about how Scoratay was able to acquire that land. This was like a years-long effort. And this is what they want to do with it. They're currently raising money. And so that paper is about that, how the community land trust model was able to help them acquire the land and how they're able to reimagine it going forward. So with the current paper, in a similar vein, Moms for Housing squatted on this home here. This is the house itself in West Oakland. And in 2019 as well, these women, this home had been vacant for 2 years. It was bought by an investor and had sat empty for 2 years, waiting for the land to appreciate. And so they squatted on the home and to raise awareness around how gentrification is happening in these neighborhoods. And so a lot of people have written about this. A lot of media outlets it became a global phenomenon. The women recently went to the Vatican to talk about their experiences. And what I want to focus on is how the city used the community land trust model to help broker this deal to purchase the home. So the theme of the paper is how this has become a toolkit in city planning. So the city put in a lot of money to acquire to establish the community land trust to then acquire the home. So I'll talk about that at the end, but really quickly, just 3 quick themes that I want to go through. I have a ton of images here that I want to get through. I always joke that I'm competing against in my classes against social media. So I always bombard people with images. But 3 main themes. First, gentrification, to think about this home within the context of a longer history and trajectory, right? So Mindy Folev's root shock is important here. Then, that not being the end of the story, displacement, thinking about housing speculation that comes out of the financial crisis, which hit Oakland particularly hard, and West Oakland even more harder. And then finally, the role of resistance and community organizing, particularly through establishing the land trust. So first, gentrification. West Oakland, where the house is located, was during World War II and shortly thereafter, the center of the Black community. Esther's Arboretum, which is the last paper I'll talk about, sat on 7th Street, which was what at the time was called the Harlem of the West. But even before then, West Oakland was, where the railroad ended if you were coming from the East Coast, and you'd have to take a ferry over to San Francisco. So it was really one of the oldest cities in the Bay Area, and for a long time, it was where Pullman porters were able to purchase homes. So it has a long history of creating stability for the Black community. So it is really a center for the African American community here on the West Coast. Like many other places, West Oakland was redlined starting in the 1930s. It was then subject to countless urban renewal projects. Segregation by design has been really good about tracking a lot of these. And in particular, West Oakland was bifurcated by not just a freeway, but also the Bay Area Rapid Transit, or BART, which really, the idea of it was to cut off West Oakland from the downtown after the downtown was revitalized. The BART, the train system, went literally straight through the 7th Street, which was, again, the Harlem of the West. This is the elevated train that's going up there. And then this is where Esther's Arboretum, the final paper I'm working on, looks like today after these projects. On the other side of these tracks, there was a USPS central hub that was put there. So a lot of houses were demolished to put in this mail hub there. So the neighborhood was really decimated by these urban renewal policies. And that was into the 2010s, really made worse through the foreclosure crisis and subsequent foreclosure and speculation on housing. So this is an image of the amount of homes that were foreclosed on between 2007 and 2011 was over 10,000 homes. And these were, the homes that were purchased by for-profit real estate companies. The idea in West Oakland was to flip homes like this, and this is a very typical scene that you see in Oakland. Homes like this that are being flipped. A lot of headlines about Oakland's Black population being decimated. In the 10-year period between 2000 and 2010, 25% drop. And so as an aftermath, Oakland experienced the 10th highest foreclosure rate of any metropolitan area between 2007 and 2011. 1 in 7 mortgages went into foreclosure. This was totaled over 10,000 homes. 45% of those homes were acquired by speculative real estate companies. I'm working with some colleagues to trace what the company that bought the Moms for Housing home. We want to trace the homes that they purchased in particular to kind of bring light to what this actually looks like. And then this culminated with a study that made headway, a lot of news that in 2019, when there was a point in time count of the homelessness in Oakland, over 70% was African American. So it's, these are all, this history is a long one. So finally, about the topic itself, the role of community land trusts. In 2019, these women squatted on this home. It brought out a lot of organizations. The women themselves worked for, they were organizers in the Bay Area, so they had deep ties to a lot of the organizing here in the Bay Area. West Oakland being the center of where the Black Panthers came out of, long history of organizing. And so a lot has been written about that, but what I want to do is focus, what I did in the paper was focus on the role of the city. And so I looked at the establishment of the community land trust and how that came out of the neighborhood stabilization funding that was initiated through Congress. About 10 million came to the city of Oakland. A huge chunk of that, a little bit over half, went to the establishment of the community land trust. And so I looked at what the community land trust had been doing and how many homes they had purchased. And I looked at how the moms had been tightly organized and connected to the Oakland Community Land Trust and how they were ultimately able to work with the Oakland CLT to purchase the home. I was able to interview Carol Fife, who was the spokesperson of the organization. This is her there. She is currently on city council. She represents the West Oakland neighborhood. She was gracious enough to give me an interview. I spoke with Rob Bonta, who is now the Attorney General of California, but he was instrumental in brokering the deal. He worked with Wedgwood, which was the real estate company who had owned the home, and worked with the city, and then also he was close with Carol, and Oakland Community Land Trust. I spoke with them as well to talk about how the city was able to work with CLT to purchase this home. This is what the home looks like today. It is part organizing center, part halfway home. They are still bringing in homeless women and providing shelter. It is still a hub for the community. So that's the ongoing work, thinking about how CLTs are able to help communities like this. So that's it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Fine. Yeah. Wait, would it work if I just did this for them?
They can.
Can you see everyone? I mean, there's not much to see.
Can our colleagues online see the? Yes, yep. we're all
Yes.
good.
Great. Let me just make sure there's time for them. All right. So yeah, I'm in philosophy and political science here on the Boston campus. I'm a philosopher and political theorist. Most of my research to date has focused on civil and uncivil disobedience and the ethics of protest in relation to political obligation, the moral duty to obey the law, and just constitutionalism broadly construed. And my newer research project is a political ethics of the resistance in the street, in the courtroom, and in prison. Next year, I'll be a fellow in residence at Harvard, where I'll focus on prison resistance. But this year, my research plan for the Humanities Center focused on courtroom resistance. And I want to share about this research and tell you how it has actually led me to examine community watch practices back in the streets. So there's still a bit of both. So my method as a philosopher consists of a back and forth reflection between abstract normative principles of political morality, so lofty ideals like freedom, self-determination, equality, and dignity, which philosophers have analyzed and written a lot about, and the practices on the ground, so especially practices of resistance and refusal as they are understood by activists who deploy them. So the overarching aim for me in everything I approach is, on the one hand, to revisit our philosophical principles in light of activists' own way of thinking with and thinking about these ideals. And on the other hand, to justify grassroots defiant practices to philosophers who typically find them impermissible and inconsistent with their own principles. So in the fall, I dived into some important case studies involving political dissidents on trial, with the twofold goal of mapping the variety of tactics of courtroom resistance and examining their motivation and value as these agents articulate them. So courtroom resistance, really broadly constructed, meaning defiance, refusal, opposition, protest against the very court proceedings that are brought against political dissidents, right? So the central case is statements from the doc. There's a lot of examples here. So it involves defendants justifying the very actions that led them to the court and indicting the illegitimacy of the tribunal. So American Indian movement activist Leonard Peltier, anti-apartheid activist Steve Biko and Nelson Mandela, the Russian feminist Pussy Riot, they all did this while indicted, making really grand expressions of justice and denouncing the legitimacy of the courts that were trying them. They're very important for my research. I also love the guerrilla theater tactics that the Chicago 8 engaged in 69 after their protest in 68. In Chicago, so especially Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman, they continually disrupted judicial decorum, not only by speaking without permission, interrupting, interfering with the judge and other testimonies, but by engaging in a range of creative, spontaneous, and unexpected actions. They brought a birthday cake to the courtroom, they blew kisses to the jury, they munched jelly beans, they called the judge a fascist dog, and more. It was a long trial. So this is also a case that to me is really important in mapping the tactics of courtroom resistance. There are also straight up refusals to cooperate with judicial proceedings. This is Assata Shakur, the member of the Black Liberation Army, who just refused to cooperate at all. I mean, there were more than one trial. She escaped from prison also and sought exile in refugee in Cuba. But there's a lot she does from the jail cell and by refusing the proceedings to defy the expectations that defendants will be acquiescent or apologetic. So that to me is really the unsettling part of the project. I'm also really interested in figuring out the different functions that courtroom resistance serves according to dissidents themselves. And there's a variety of them. So they purport to set the record straight about the political reality in the street and the oppression that members of their community are suffering. They situate their action in a history of struggle. They call into being, they constitute a very community of resistance. They galvanize a movement. They magnify the dynamics of epistemic injustice that pervade the courtroom. They affirm their own dignity. They express a fitting contempt toward an unfair court, and more. Now, I also came to realize that courtroom resistance extends beyond the dissident defendants and often relies on various other actors inside and outside the courtroom. This is cut here, but the banner says "Free Leonard Peltier." So there's a whole movement backing Peltier, the Turtle Mountain Chippewa activist from AIM, who was in prison for nearly 50 years on murder charges. And we need to see this too as part of courtroom resistance, given the movement's denunciation of the injustice of the trial and the efforts to alert the public. This movement grew to encompass an Amnesty International campaign, which was crucial to Peltier's eventual pardon last year, just days before President Biden left office. So what happens outside greatly matters for political trial, as the Black Panthers knew well. Two, with their Free Huey Newton and Free the Panther 21 campaigns, they raise awareness, educate the people, build and energize a resistance movement. In my effort to draw up a complete topology of courtroom resistance, I was also interested in how attorneys and ordinary people inside the courtroom can play a part. A paradigmatic figure for me here is infamous attorney Jacques Vergès, is French, who defended Algerian freedom fighters and Nazi collaborators alike. He articulated what he called a strategy of rupture that's based in part on the tout quoque defense in the trial against the French colonial empire and its brutal counterinsurgency tactics. It's a very controversial character, but that to me like really embodies the attorney doing courtroom resistance. And that's really how we thought about the work he was doing. Today, the legal school of thought known as movement law and centers like the Movement Law Lab bring the power of lawyers to social justice movements. They defend activists on trial for free and with excellent representation, and they build collective power. I was also keen to reflect on community court watch programs, where volunteers get trained to monitor bail hearings, criminal trials, sentencing hearings, and immigration proceedings to document practices, highlight inequities, increase transparency in the legal system, and advocate for reform. Evidence shows that the mere presence of these observers helps to prevent abuses of power by judges and prosecutors. And these programs matter too, though they constitute less visible and less spectacular forms of courtroom resistance. So I started delving into that, and I realized that the court watch programs are often undertaken by groups who also monitor law enforcement practices in the street. And then they use that evidence in the courtroom, especially to debunk the narratives offered by police about what happened. So we have cop watching, the National Lawyer Guild's legal observers at protest events, Ice Watch. And because Ice Watch was all over the news with the events in Minnesota, I decided in the spring, like just in late January, to pivot my research for the rest of the semester to focus on community watch practices, which have just never received any philosophical attention. The same streets that ICE watchers are patrolling today in Minnesota were patrolled by AIM activists half a century ago to record and deter police misconduct and discriminatory enforcements. And these indigenous activists had borrowed cop watching from the Black Panthers. So related. So there's a long tradition of community watch practices to examine, and there's a little bit of scholarship from law and from the social sciences to reflect on it. But I wanted to offer philosophical tools to that reflection. So I'm just going to share that one last slide to tell you where I'm at in that research. So the common defense that people offer to IceWatch is that it's a kind of citizen journalism, right? So we're familiar with the value of bystander recordings, but this is an organized, systematic version of that using the tools of what's called surveillance, right? In the surveillance studies literature, surveillance like reverses the panopticon. And they do that to collect data about government practices, to promote transparency and increase accountability. But I think it's really important to note that like community watch practices would still be needed even if the government collected the data and shared the data. Because what matters is government misconduct, not just transparency. A common criticism is that it's a kind of, that community watch is a kind of vigilantism that involves self-appointed activists taking the law into their own hands and interfering with the work of law enforcement agency to the point that the Trump administration labeled the 2 US citizens murdered by ICE in January and the broader movement domestic terrorists. That is mistaken, but I think it's really important to explain exactly why it's mistaken and in which ways. So it is a lawful and constitutionally protected activity actually to watch law enforcement. And it typically involves, and it's non-retaliatory against the what vigilantism means, which is taking the law into your own hands to punish wrongdoers. It's not a retaliatory activity. It also typically doesn't use aggressive tactics, but I'm actually going to articulate an ethic, not here, an ethic of obstruction to explain why I think that in lots of cases, more aggressive confrontation with law enforcement on the ground is important. And another thing, I don't know if you know Dahlia Listwick, she's a great legal commentator, and she thinks that what's happening with ICE Watch and cop watching is a form of popular constitutionalism that involves activists standing up to protect the Constitution, first, the second, the Fourth Amendments, and so on. And I think it's pretty clear that the primary goal of these groups actually is not protecting the Constitution, is to protect the people. Sometimes to protect their constitutional rights, but not only, because in the case of immigration law enforcement, undocumented citizens have very few rights. And so it's not just about that. What I think is going on is that community watch is a kind of protective direct action that's designed to keep the community safe, to prevent harm, and first and foremost, and that's what they can do just by mere presence and observation. If you zoom out of like the pure work of ICE Watch, cop watching, and so on, you see that it's entire networks providing mutual aid to the community and building a resistance movement through consciousness raising and this community bonding, which we saw firsthand in Minnesota. And again, the philosophical normative part of this is an understanding of how community watch practices are grounded in local associative obligations. So it's not your general universal duty of justice. It's very local. Adam Serwer in an Atlantic piece called that neighborism. It's local and role-based. There's something really interesting that happens with ICE Watch and Cop Watch, which is that those with most privilege go out in the street to protect the most vulnerable among them. So it's that, it's a role-based and place-based, and it's justified where the government fails to uphold its duty to protect and serve. So that's where I'm at, and it's been great. Thank you to the Humanities Center and my fellow fellows. No rush.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Your girl can talk, so I will do my best to keep it tight. All right, not unlike the places and spaces that I'm studying, my project goes by many names. So right now we're talking cruzando fronteras en todas partes, crossing borders everywhere. Next, please.
Who's doing the,
Yeah, no.
Oh, next, please.
is it possible for you to?
I'll have.
There you go.
Plug in. Oh, excellent. Thank you. So the crux of this work is looking at how, we occupy the same geography, but these are really radically different landscapes. So here, we are looking at specifically 1930s California. And I am looking at movement through the Central Valley and Southern valleys of California. And in this place during the 1930s, and in particularly 1938, we have wealthy soon-to-be politicians doing study tours of the FSA camps. We have young women, particularly young Black women, that are being told never to take the main road because they will be sexually assaulted. And we also have female, white, oaky journalists traveling together, doing very close and intensive field work, and particularly looking into vigils for murdered Mexican-American strike workers, and to examine their argument that California could become a fascist state any day now. And what interests me in this is that these are not separate stories, but that really this is a manifestation of a single crisis. And that crisis, yes, it's the Great Depression, but it's not economic, it is actually spatial. And so I'm looking at the Great Depression as a crisis of movement, who could move and how, who was stopped and where, social mobility, whose movement generated wealth and whose generated criminality. Next, please. So, oh, sorry, and next again. So at the crux of this is this framework of biomobilities. So I want to reinterpret the Great Depression and the region that I'm looking at through this lens of biomobility, which is kind of like my working definition, the entanglement of physical movement with lived experience, embodiment, and structural constraint that actually are some of like the determining factors in shaping political consciousness over time and space. Next, please. The purpose of this is to kind of like invert the conventional framing of not just the Great Depression, but the Great Depression in the American West. That migration was not a consequence of this economic collapse, that the systems regulating who could move where and under what conditions had been going under absolutely radical destabilization and violent reconsolidation. And that is where we can kind of locate like this deeper understanding of not only the antecedents, but the afterlives of the Great Depression in the region. Next, please. And so there's 4 different like domains of biomobilities that I am looking at. And those in particular are the physical movement of people, migration, incarceration, forced removal, travel, political mobility, access to institutions, representation, and the capacity to engage with and shape policies. Embodied and effective mobility, the fear, hope, the imagination, the solidarity and exhaustion that people experienced, and also archival mobility. This kind of gets a little bit into the afterlives. Who gets documented, by whom, and how? Next, please. How this really started off is I became interested in a woman named Helen Gahagan Douglas, who was a starlet actress who became a California Congresswoman. And she was seen as like an early forebear of like this like civil rights movement amongst like, you know, white female like liberals, and looking into not only like her role, but like who are the people that she talked to that enabled her to enter these spaces. Because a blue blood from New England who's suddenly talking about indigenous rights and California as a colonized landscape for Black people, you talked to somebody. Who did you talk to? That's who I was really interested in. So my argument here is kind of like using her as this kind of entry point, is that her knowledge is embodied, and that is what informed her politics. And really, this is kind of like a return to that mind-body connection that has largely been dismantled in a lot of like these conventional narratives. Her transformation as she traveled across the country and was horrified first by the slum and these slum people that transformed into her being intensely interested and invested in the roles of women and children, especially who are living in these FSA camps, to her deciding to run for Congress, are a result of her mobilities. So what we're looking at here is that elite mobility is relationally produced, and I wanted to uncover those relations. Next, please. So in doing this, and as research tends to do, it has morphed. So in thinking about space and place, you also have to think about how that space and place is oriented. So what I'm finding is that this approach really kind of breaks away from that east to west trajectory, especially of America in the world, that is very manifest destiny. And instead, I'm kind of thinking through this more, and this is very squishy. I'm looking at my chair and advisor and mentor, like, are you thinking more about this?
Taking notes.
Yeah. Of looking at this more as a North American West circuitry. So kind of reorienting the region away from this US manifest destiny into like this longer durée of colonialism and racial capitalism. And in doing that, the Great Depression in particular starts to take on the contours of the Porfiriato, of the benevolent dictatorship that was taking place in the late 19th century in Mexico, of the hacienda system of these peones families, of the violence and the erasure of Inde stories, and how much the violence against Inde communities really drove economic and global and colonial nation building in this region. And then into thinking about this region during the Great Depression, not just as a region in the Great Depression that got a lot of migrants, but as a region that was still reeling in the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution. All that kind of came through that. So this is kind of where I'm situating myself. And it's interesting doing this work from New England and being someone from Southern California, because I'm personally grappling with this idea of, I don't see this region as being an add-on to America. I'm like, y'all were doing your thing over here, we were doing here, and this all kind of came together. So that's been an interesting thing to think through. Next, please. So over the course of this fellowship, I have had a lot of space and time. I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. And what I've been incredibly thankful for is that I've had the time to be able to pivot and reconsider my work and where it stands in relation to historical and contemporary events. I was several months into working on and doing research using Cesar Chavez as my entry point. Some of the nods in the room, yeah, that got real fun real quick. I was emailing back and forth with the Cesar Chavez Foundation. They were working on digitizing a lot of like the papers. And then when this news broke, it was kind of like, hey, we're figuring stuff out, so we'll get back to you. I'm like, do what you got to do. Ultimately, I'm going forward with this chapter for a number of reasons. One, can't shy away from crappy people doing crappy things in history. Otherwise, we would have nothing to write about. Also, it's complicated. And much like how Helen Gahagan Douglas was this entry point into looking at these unseen but no less unimportant, or not unimportant foundational figures, this was an opportunity to really dig into that and see how this worked in when put up against like this great man narrative. So I've been going forward and recovering this like long durée through Cesar Chavez, who has a significant archival footprint, much less Helen Gahagan Douglas. And in doing so, I have been able to trace his family back to 1850s Chihuahua, Mexico, and baptismal records, and then come forward and look at the hacienda system, all these negotiations of like the big ag that were coming up, and the role of the many people who contributed to the movement and contributed to making things better, whose names aren't recorded, who don't have statues like Cesar Chavez did. So that is where I am working on right now with that section. Next, please. And then finally, we've been talking about, I mentioned the archival mobility. So Helen Gahagan Douglas has hundreds of feet at the University of Oklahoma. The FSA photos, Dorothea Lange, such a huge footprint. But what is not in these archives, and that what we can use them for, is to get in again to these unnamed but no less unimportant folks. And I have this image here of the pea picker woman from Dorothea Lange. I mean, it is like the photo of the Great Depression. Interviews with her, she did not want her photo taken. She was told that she would get a copy of it, and none of that ever materialized. Her name is Florence. Florence was her name, and her existence was never attached to this photo until much, much later. Florence and her children were enrolled members of the Cherokee and Choctaw Nation. So she was held up as a symbol of kind of like white motherhood and suffering, erasing this longer, messier, complicated history with racial capitalism and colonialism. And then the image that I have on the far side, that is not historic, though it certainly could be. It is women delivering foodstuffs and other sustenance to people traveling on La Bestia, who are part of migrant workers. That is a photo that was taken last year. It could have been taken in 1925, could have been taken in 1885. Next, please. So where I'm at, California, global node, not just in the 1930s, but historically and embedded in the longue durée of North American West circuitry. Next, please. And then where I'm going, the next steps, I'm going to be looking into the life of a woman named Dolores Hernandez, who was murdered in 1933 by white supremacist vigilantes for striking in the fields for better conditions for migrant workers. The Babb sisters, the field workers I mentioned before. And I'm also going to be looking into the built environment of the 99 freeway and this little town, Johannesburg, California. Yes, so that has an interesting story too. Again, I'm going to try to keep it tight. Next, please. Thank you. And finally, I want to say, and this is very awkward, so I might turn as pink as my pants right now, that because of the Global Humanities Center Fellowship, I not only have been able to work on my dissertation, because like when y'all did it, I never did this before, so it's been really nice to have that space. But I've also been able to get drafts out of 2 chapters. I was able to co-curate a spatial event that looked at, it was a museum exhibit that looked at the spatial autonomy of women in the anti-apartheid movement. I was able to co-author a chapter for debates in digital humanities, and that got accepted. I was able to work on another co-authored article for the Association of Mexican American Educators. So that has submitted recently. So hopefully that has good results. I'm going to be presenting my work at the Western History Association and also hosting a roundtable around archival methods. This actually very recently, thanks to the fantastic Gretchen Hefner, I just got word that I received a Garden Club of America Research Fellowship. Yeah, so I'm a Garden Club scholar. And I'm also going to be able to go to, ignore the typo, San Antonio and UT Austin to do research and talk about my work. So thank you very much. So next slide, final one.
Sorry.
Just got excited.
And one more. Sorry, one more slide. Thank you, everybody. So thank you very, very much. 2 minutes over.
You did beautifully.
So unfortunately, like we don't have, we're at time right now, so we don't have time for Q&A, but I just wanted to say thank you to all the fellows, not only the ones that spoke today, but also everyone who's a part of the program, part of the sort of cohort for this year. There's been a lot of really cool research that has come out of it. And for those of you who have just come to see what everyone else is up to, thank you as well. Yeah, so thank you to all of you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Congrats.